We are going to read from Luke 17 this morning. A story that I kind of vividly remember from childhood. I can vividly picture the flannel graph. Flannel graph, anybody remember that? Yeah, the flannel graph, and there were these 10 men. And that flannel graph, they just looked sad, but in reality, you'll see. Luke chapter 17, starting at verse 11. Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Lord, guide our hearts, guide our minds. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When I was a fairly new believer, I remember the phrase that seemed to be really popular in my little group of Christians, that we needed to have an attitude of gratitude. And that's a pretty good phrase, but I'm not sure it really reflects the biblical teaching about gratitude. In fact, more than 80% of the time when the Bible talks about giving thanks or about gratitude, it doesn't talk about a mindset, it talks about a life set. Generally, gratitude in the Bible is something we do more than just simply being an attitude we have. Now, ideally, it flows from a grateful heart, clearly. But if you think back even to the Old Testament, when God was giving the people of Israel their guidelines on what they were supposed to do and their religious ceremonies and all the things they were supposed to do, there were thanks offerings, things they were supposed to do. He didn't just say, "Be grateful." He said, "Give thanks." And I think that's important, and we really see this in this passage. It's something that we give, not always something that we feel, right? Like, I remember when I was growing up, we had a great aunt who I'm not sure I ever met, because I was in Iowa and she lived far away in Illinois or something like that. And this great aunt would always give us Christmas gifts. She'd never married, never had children. And Julie and I found her tombstone about a year ago. But I remember that sometimes we had this wonderful present from Great Aunt Mary West. There's her name. Okay. And sometimes it was an awesome thing, and sometimes it was one of those gifts that you go, that's great. And I think there were probably times that it was good that she wasn't there in the room, because she would have been underwhelmed by our gratitude. But our parents always said to us, write her a note. Write her a thank you note. Come on, Mom, did you see this shirt she gave me? Tell her thank you. And I think it is important for us to remember that kind of thought, because this isn't just something we need to teach the 7-year-olds. This is an attitude change and an action change that will totally change the world if we embrace it. I think this passage gives us 3 reasons why we should give thanks. And let's walk through the passage. First of all, we should give thanks because of who we are. If you're taking notes, the first line is we. Who we are. Now, you understand, I think, that as you're reading the Bible, especially in the Gospels, there is almost always somebody we're supposed to relate to. Sometimes there are several different characters in a parable, or it's telling a story about something that happened to Jesus, and it will say, the crowd did this, but the Pharisees did this, and some people did this, and it is very clear that we're supposed to decide who we connect with, who we relate with, who we see ourselves in. And it's interesting, if you read several chapters of Luke around this passage, you'll notice that there are usually a couple different options. Like, we can find ourselves in the parable of the prodigal son. We can say, are we the prodigal son, or are we the older brother? Then in Luke 16, there was a rich man and Lazarus, and they both die. And then it asks us the question, basically, who are you going to be like? Well, in this passage, we don't have a choice in terms of who we're supposed to be like. I mean, yeah, we could choose to be the 1 or the 9, but the 1 isn't honestly somebody that we want to be like. Because he's a leper and a Samaritan. I mean, this is not somebody we want to identify with. In chapter 18, we have this parable about 2 people going up to pray, and one is a good, upstanding, religious person who everybody would have said, oh, to be one of those guys, that would be so awesome. And then there's this tax collector, a crook, a traitor, a reject from society, a spiritual and social and political ew. And Jesus says, be like that guy. In this passage, we have a hero who's a Samaritan leper. A Samaritan was somebody, they were like half-breeds who were kind of Jewish, but kind of weren't. And there was a deep-seated hatred among God's people for the Samaritans. They didn't agree what God was going to do. They didn't agree with what God had done. They didn't agree with where you were supposed to worship. They were rejected. They were spiritually unworthy. And yet, Jesus is saying, Be like this. And not only is a Samaritan, but he's a leper. I mean, there was really almost nothing you could be that would be worse than a Samaritan leper. A lot of parents would have said, do you want your child, if we asked them, do you want your child to be a Samaritan leper or a murderer? I don't know. Samaritan leper or prostitute? I don't know. Prostitutes make pretty good money. I mean, this was bad. There was no worse disease you could get. In fact, one historian wrote at that time that literally a disease that would kill you quickly would be better than leprosy. Partly because of what it would do to you in society, partly because of what it would do to you in your physical health. They tended to categorize a lot of different skin diseases as leprosy. But the main form of leprosy that still exists a few places in the world now is Hansen's disease. And basically what happens, as I understand it, if you're a medical professional, correct me later, you stop feeling in your nerve endings. And so you get infections and diseases, and they slowly eat your body away. So these 10 guys that are standing at a distance calling out to Jesus, many of them might have a stub of a leg or a few fingers missing or an ear gone or a nose gone. It would have been something where people were like, ew, don't come near me. And this guy's a Samaritan. So they stand at a distance in verse 12 and 13, and they call out to Jesus. We need to understand how bad the person is that God is calling us to identify with. See, I think our lack of gratitude often comes because we don't see ourselves accurately. Right? Honestly, don't you sometimes look around and say, well, I'm not as bad as that guy. And Jesus said, you're a Samaritan leper, or you should be. Well, actually you are. You just don't know it. We look at people, like last night I said there was a shooting on the Bishop Ford, and we're like, oh, I bet. And some of us honestly have a mental picture of that person. I won't interrogate that, but we have a mental picture. And we think, well, that's a bad person. Jesus says, you're a Samaritan leper. Our lack of gratitude, I think, often comes because we think that on the whole scale, like this is Billy Graham / Mother Teresa, and this is Hitler, most of us think, I'm at least in the middle somewhere, right? But this story apparently says Hitler and you. Because we're broken. There was a guy, I've been listening to his biography named Jack Miller, who actually has influenced all of you. You just don't know it. because he has influenced incredibly a whole lot of really significant spiritual people and preachers and teachers in our society. And the book of the Jack Miller biography is called Cheer Up. And what Jack Miller used to say is this: cheer up, you're a worse sinner than you ever dared imagine, and you're more loved than you ever dared to hope. Let me say it again. You're a worse sinner than you ever dared imagine, and you're more loved than you ever dared hope. When I was in Tanzania, 2010 probably, I saw, so we were in a Maasai village. You know, the Maasai are those really tall people that jump up and down a lot. See that? Both my feet left the ground at the same time. Maybe the last time it'll ever happen in my life. The Maasai word for thank you is, my head is in the dirt. In other words, I'm not worthy of this. I lower myself because of the gift you've given. And I think that if we really understood that, if we understood that we are not worthy of the grace and the love and the mercy and the power and the adoption of God, imagine how much more grateful we would be if we understood it. You see, even if you've grown up in church, I think we forget. I mean, think about this. Honestly, step back, look at your own life, look at your own sin, and isn't it easy to say, well, my sin's serious, but it doesn't deserve a death penalty? We don't think our sin deserves a death penalty, then we think Jesus didn't really need to die for us. You see, the healthy Christian life, as we see in this, because clearly the hero is the Samaritan leper, the healthy Christian life comes from two apparently contradictory truths. One is that we can come into the throne of grace with confidence. God says, call me Dad. God invites us in not to crawl and grovel on our faces. God says, walk in, talk to me, be my child. And that's awesome. But the other side of this contradictory truth is the fact that we're not worthy of that in ourselves. Paul, at the peak of this amazing life of impacting millions of people, billions of people, eventually, Paul says, I am the chief of sinners. Why should we give thanks? We should give thanks because of who we are. We need to understand that the righteousness of Jesus has been credited to us because Jesus died. But that always and forever will be a paycheck we didn't earn. We should give thanks because of who we are. And it starts out by saying, we are desperate and lost and broken. And honestly, I mean, body parts falling off, we're ugly. And in fact, a lot of forms of leprosy eventually affect the mind, both because of societal outcastness and because of some of the things that get into the blood system. So we are ugly and weird and broken but God loves us. We should give thanks because of who we are. Secondly, we should give thanks because of what God has done. Now, this is crazy stuff. Jesus says in verse 14, when he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." Now, has he healed them yet? No. I think if you'd asked me a week ago or 2 weeks ago to tell you this story, I would have said, Jesus healed them, and then they went and no. Or even that Jesus said, you're going to be healed, go and no. Jesus says, do the thing that you're supposed to do after you're healed, even though you're not healed yet. He doesn't even promise healing. He basically is saying, trust me that I'm in this. Trust me that my command is good. We need to give thanks because of what God has done, because it's clear that somehow Jesus is the solution here. Everything has been given by him. Job 121, after he's lost everything, Job says, I came naked from the womb, naked shall I return. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In other words, we need to remind ourselves that everything we have, all the forgiveness, all the goodness, all the stuff, everything comes directly from God. James 1:17 says, every good and perfect gift is sent from above. Imagine how our lives would be subtly and entirely different if we really believed that. Right? I mean, those of you that have a job, when you get a paycheck, I mean, I know we say, oh, it's from God, but it sure does feel like it's from insert your employer or your pension fund or Social Security or whatever. Imagine if we fully believed that it was a gracious, unearned gift from God. Imagine if we woke up every morning and said, oh, I'm alive. Oh, that's a gift from God. Thank you so much. You know, you've heard this before, but what if instead of saying, good God, it's morning, what if we said, good morning, God? This is honestly one of the things that attracted me to a reformed understanding of Christianity. This idea that we understood that everything is from God. And as we think about what God has done and who we are, the two competing truths, the Bible makes it clear. If you go to Psalm 19, this is great. It says, basically, Lord, there are sins that I don't even know I'm committing. Forgive those because I don't even see what I've done. That's what God has done. He has looked at us in our brokenness and our misunderstanding and our rebellion and our hatred and our selfishness. And he has said, go show yourselves to the priests. And as we go, we are well. So they're going, these 10 lepers, and we don't know what the other 9 were, but it's clear from the way Jesus responds that it was a mixed group. Normally, Jews didn't hang out with lepers ever, but if you were a leper, you were just finding anybody you could hang out with. And so there's one that's a Samaritan. At least some of the other 9 must have been Jewish. And they're going, as they went, they are cleansed. Imagine that moment. Cleansed, made whole, healed. I mean, skin rashes just fading away. Fingers growing back. Ears and noses that maybe have been gone for months or years reappearing. It's kind of creepy in some ways. But can you imagine that moment? I mean, if you had leprosy, you could never come near to your children or grandchildren or spouse ever again. And all of a sudden, you're healthy. All of a sudden, you are made whole. And there's this moment when 9 of them probably are going, I get to see my kids again. I mean, imagine for a moment if John DeYoung had leprosy and he could never see Copen except from a distance ever again. And Kelly too, but mostly Copen. And then he's made well. He's made whole. He's on a plane to Florida to see that baby and his baby instantly. Well, and Kyle too, but you know. This, can you imagine? Does it ever say that the other 9 weren't grateful? In fact, can you even imagine that they weren't? If you have leprosy and you are healed, you're grateful, but apparently their gratitude to Jesus is overwhelmed by what they want, by the other loves in their life. One person out of the 10 says, I must go to Jesus. And the other 9 go on. I don't know if they go to the priests or what, or they go to their family. I don't know. Apparently it doesn't matter. The one who does the right thing says, I'm going back to Jesus. He throws himself at Jesus' feet. Kind of reminds me of the Messiah word for thank you. My head is in the dirt. See, the third reason that we need to give thanks is because of what gratitude does. It pleases Jesus. Jesus looks at this guy and says, where are the other 9? And he says, your faith has made you well. That's what gratitude does. It pleases God, but it also reminds us what really matters, and it reminds us of the source of all good things. Now, one other thing I want to mention here. 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 4. It's talking about the end times, and it's talking about how bad people will be. Here's what it says. There will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money. And it goes on and it says, they will be slanderous, unforgiving, without love, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure, ungrateful. It's in the same list. We should be grateful because of what gratitude does. It changes us. And in fact, in Luke 17, there's something that is significant here. They've been healed. The leper has been healed. The Samaritan has been healed. And Jesus says, rise and go. Your faith has made you well. Wait a minute. Couldn't Jesus say that to everybody? But that word, your faith has made you well, the verb there is sozo, which is the same verb that would be used to say, you've been saved. Everybody in this parable, all 10, have been physically healed. This guy has been saved because he realizes what Jesus has done for him. So what? I want to challenge you to open your eyes and thank God. To speak thank you, to sing thank you, to pray thank you, to say thank you by giving, to give thank you, to live thank you. I remember when we were fairly newly married, we lived in the basement of a family in Elmhurst for a few months while our apartment was being finished. They were finishing building it. And Benj Petrulia, who we named our son after, he was 4. And one day at a Sunday noon meal, we were sitting with that family, and Benj was going to say the prayer, 4-year-old. And we all, our eyes closed, our heads bowed, and I hear Benjamin say things like, God, thank you for Mommy and Daddy and Jody and Liza and Jenny. And thank you for the sunshine and the trampoline. And thank you for the meat. And thank you for the potatoes. And thank you. And you realize he got his eyes open. And he's just thanking God for whatever he sees. He's a pastor today, but he was that wise when he was 4. What if we opened our eyes and thank God for everything that we see?